Shall we make a start then? I think we've got a good selection of people here. So just to check you're in the right place, this is the data debate discussion. So looks like you're in the right place, which is absolutely fantastic. I'm Joe Pisani. I'm from PwC, where I lead our pharma consulting group. And today we're going to be exploring the various issues around both the advantages and the benefits of data, but also what do we need to be wary of in terms of integrity and actually making best insight of what's available. So really lucky to be joined today, and I'll let each panellist introduce themselves when they do their introductions, but with Peter Knight, who's Executive Director from the Oxford University Hospitals Trust and Senior Fellow from the Nuffield School of Medicine and Population Health at Oxford, Gerald Law, who's Chief Executive of Innovation DB, Shahid Hanif from the ABPI, where he's Head of Health Data and Outcomes, and Nick Mead, Director of Policy Genetic Alliance UK, and also Chris Turnbull from Pfizer, where he's Informatics and Technology Lead for the drug product supply. So it's great. I think we've got a really good panel right through from policy through to a government spin-out using data, to the industry view, and also then into manufacturing and also what's happening from the genetics perspective. So actually primed for some really interesting debate today. So maybe I'll just ask each of the panellists in turn to, over 5 minutes, explain what they're doing in this field and really talk about some of their discussion points. I'll then I'll ask some questions of the panel, but then it's over to you, because I think our aim is to make this a very interactive discussion. So Peter, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak this morning, or this afternoon now. So I'm one of those hybrid weirdos, because I used to be policy working for Dame Sally Davis on this whole agenda of data and research, and now I'm a user of it, so I have myself to blame in most instances. So in essence, my view on all of this space really is that actually, you know, if you think about every 36 hours there's 1 million patients seen in the NHS, we have billions of pieces of data that we transact during that process. And actually using that data to support the research evidence base about what's good and what's not good and what's average in terms of treatments and novel medicines is hugely important. And I spent probably out of the last 15 years, the last 10 years, focusing on how do you release the data in real time, how do you make that available in a secure and controlled way, and then how do you make sure that that data is then used in an appropriate way for the types of research that we want to conduct as part of the sort of general life sciences delivery. And I think the biggest struggle that everybody will cover with is it's not technology causes these problems, it's predominantly governance. It's around the whole issue about, do you share the data or don't you share the data? What form do you share that data in? How do you know that data is reliably sourced? Is a blood test in one organisation the same as a blood test in another organisation? And what's the reference ranges? And can you normalise that data? And it's all the things I'm now doing as part of the Big Data Institute at Oxford. So it's kind of a really interesting space for me. And I think we've got quite polarised in some of the debate, and we need to be very clear about particularly the use of data with our citizens, you know, why it's important. And actually I used to do lots of town hall meetings, and it was very clear from those town hall meetings that actually everybody expects us to use data. What they want is transparency about it, and that's, I think, a really important part of the journey that's going on at the moment. And of course my chairman of my trust is also the National Data Guardian, and she's trying to make very clear the sort of the rules of engagement in terms of how we deal with this. And I think one of the things I'm interested in, and particularly talking to the Information Commissioner over the last few years, is there's a move really from saying actually where harm may be ensued, actually it would be not appropriate for you not to share, i.e. you should share data, and actually making data available in that way is quite crucial. So that's really good for care, but then what do you do about research and what do you do about life sciences? And actually in the same way we need to make it available. I think there's been a lot of good work with GEL, so Genomics England Limited, about access to the data sets they're creating and a compute over model of delivery, which I think is safe and secure and understandable. We're just about to see, having John Bell, another colleague of mine, has sort of launched the life sciences industrial strategy piece, and the digital innovation hubs are due to be set up. Of course, I'm very interested in bidding for one, as you would be surprised. But you know, in reality, that's another area where we can start to really put the UK as a data engine back on the map in that sense. So that's kind of my opening gambit.
That's very useful, yeah. And I guess, it's been a theme throughout yesterday and today, just the opportunities we've got through industrial strategy and through potentially the announcements over the coming weeks. Indeed. To really stimulate that piece. I hope you're picking up on that as being a critical driver. Gerald, would you like to share your point of view, please?
Sure. Hello, everybody. So I have started out life as an academic in Oxford, so sorry about that. Went and worked for one of the big American strategy houses, so double sorry about that. But then got involved in a whole string of startup companies, bought a couple of companies, sold one, and consequently got approached by one of the research councils to set up what was called the UK Innovation Forum, to try and help early stage companies and universities generally to link to bigger business. And we found ourselves after a few years with staff in 6 countries, linking people around 25 different countries. So we had to drop the UK from the name because it was confusing everybody. And along the way, driven by the members of the community, we had started to develop a database, and that is now dramatically the biggest in the world in its space, at least 10 times bigger than anything else that we know of, and our users who are big corporates tell us the same. So we changed our name to Innovation DB, and that's who we are, Innovation Database. I get to come to these kind of panels quite often because we connect so many people across different sectors. And I sit on VC investment panels and things like that. But it's unusual for me to be actually asked to comment on data as such, despite the fact that it's kind of right in the middle of what we do. So I'm really pleased to join in this discussion with these very informed people around me. The thing I'd like to stress, however, is that people share data all the time. Yes, we're all carrying it around in our pockets. And what I think is completely missing with the debates I've heard around all of this kind of stuff, with the sharing of different forms of personal data for healthcare, is that kind of immediate feedback loop. I mean, you give Facebook outrageous rights to your personal data because you can talk to your friends 2 minutes later, yeah? But, you allow your medical data to be sent off to some repository somewhere where it can be shared with Bupa or something, and it disappears, and you have no idea what happens to it. There's no feedback, no, as you say, transparency about what's happening with it, and so people automatically verge in the Daily Mail direction of conspiracy and government selling our private data for companies to make money out of us and all the rest of it. And I just think it's foolish from the point of view of engaging the people whose data it is. And our original brief actually talked about blockchain and things like that, which is completely irrelevant. Yeah, it's about getting people to understand in small steps what's immediately in it for them in terms of sharing their data. And then you will find that people get taken along a journey. That's my belief. And in a few years' time, we'll get to a point where everyone assumes that it's an entirely healthy thing that data of this sort is being shared with pharmaceutical companies and the other, because they'll be used to the idea that it brings quick, positive results for them personally. So that's my my personal little soapbox.
Very good. All right. So Shahid, the industry view.
Yeah, so I work with the ABPI, the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry, and have been with them since about 2014 following the publication of their big data roadmap, and really to lead a lot of the work around the use of health data. Most of our work is we kind of put into 3 camps really. One is around communication about how we communicate the potential benefits of coming to the UK to do health data research work. And another is really about capacity building, about what are the kind of opportunities around building capabilities and capacity, the kind of skills which are needed. And the last is really around developing that health data ecosystem and how we would look to engage with it. From an industry perspective, starting from early discovery and research in terms of how you might use omics data, all the way through to the development through clinical trials, and then how you can kind of potentially get the right kind of evidence to facilitate and accelerate early access and accelerated access to adoption as well, and demonstrating the right kind of evidence as well as the data which highlights the kind of the safe use of medicines as well. For this particular session, I think my main interest is really around the work that the Wellcome Trust had highlighted around the public attitudes of kind of commercial use of health data. And we actually held a workshop with Understanding Patient Data earlier this week, really, which was around mapping how patient data really flows from early discovery all the way to pharmacovigilance and safety, which was actually quite enlightening. You realise that it's quite a complex process, and it's quite a complex process to explain to the public, and how are you going to effectively communicate not just the benefits, but also what are the kind of what are the things which are in place, which mean that the pharmaceutical company, how well regulated they are, and what kind of structure they have in place in terms of securing the data that they hold, who they potentially work with, because quite often a lot of the use of health data is not primarily done by the pharmaceutical company themselves, quite often in partnership with others, including academics as well. And I think that's been kind of quite enlightening and will help shape some of the work that we go on to do, really to highlight how we as an industry are dependent on a kind of an improved data access and environment with the appropriate governance in place as well.
Okay, good. So a simplified approach, and again, the transparency argument.
Yeah.
So Nick, so you're from a UK charity, again, generating some of this data and potentially using it as well. So interested in your view.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm from Genetic Alliance UK, which is the UK umbrella organisation for everyone affected by genetic conditions. We have around 190 membership organisations, each caring for people affected by specific genetic conditions. So I wanted to introduce rare diseases as an issue. There's a tremendous unmet health need in rare diseases. The International Rare Disease Research Consortium tallies 222 new treatments for rare conditions since the initiatives in the beginning of the century to incentivize some of that work, which is a drop in the ocean compared to the many thousands of rare diseases there are. And the gap between those rare diseases and the number of treatments is actually growing, because since 2010 we've characterized 700 new rare diseases. Data on rare diseases is crucial to progress in addressing this unmet health need. And if you look at those 222 treatments, you'll find at the root of that, there's quite likely to be a very organised patient organisation that's been doing work since the 80s or the 90s, collecting longitudinal data on patients living with those conditions. That allows us to find the target for treatment, and it also helps us get the treatment to market. Once we've developed it, we can show what life is like for someone living with that condition. So I think I just want to reflect on the importance of networking around rare disease data. You're unlikely to have enough rare disease data in any administrative area. It's important to share data across borders. The International Rare Disease Research Consortium itself is an initiative of the European Commission, and within the EU we have lots of pieces of infrastructure that allows us to share data for research purposes, organise research across borders, and share information about clinical care across borders as well. So I think that gives us some targets for a positive Brexit settlement there. And if anyone's frustrated with me droning on about rare diseases, can I just link them to targeted medicine? So any problem we're facing in developing treatments for rare diseases is very much likely to be a problem related to highly targeted treatments in the future. So I think to get the most out of rare disease data, we need to ensure that the originators or producers of that data, patients, sadly I can't say owners of that data always. In the NHS, health records are owned by the Secretary of State for Health, which doesn't look brilliant, I think, in the current environment. And it's important that we bring those patients and families with us when we talk about progress in using data. And we've done some work to ask our members what they think about sharing data, and they reflect back on the unmet health need I've described and say, look, just use it, get it out there. And often some of these members have put their children on the front page of the newspaper to try to generate energy to solve some of this unmet health need. So we need to inform patients where the value lies in sharing data and link data to progress in research and improving care design. We've had a bad experience in England around healthcare records and their sharing. I don't think we need to have a long discussion on care.data, but I think it's important to reflect that actually that problem isn't necessarily over. Peter's chair, Dame Fiona Caldecott, has made some recommendations about future opt-out methods to define how whether we're sharing our data or not in England, and they're due to come into effect in March, and we haven't quite yet decided how we're going to communicate on that yet. So that's a problem that I think we would say let's make sure we get it right before we urgently do that. So I just wanted to finish by saying that we need to be clear why data is being used, who is using it, and on what basis it's been shared.
Yeah. Okay. No. Thanks for that, Nick. And I guess because when we were talking about it, we're saying again with particularly rare diseases, it's quite difficult to have absolutely unidentifiable patient data given the rarity of it. But you're also saying that the positive impact of it.
Yeah, and our members definitely don't want that specificity to hold anything back.
No, that's right. And I'm just wondering, you raised the point of care.data as well, which clearly is a critical issue for the UK, and particularly as we drive with industrial strategy. I just wondered if one of the panel wanted to comment on that. She says, looking at Peter.
I could feel the vibe. I sit in a very difficult position on this one because I was working for Sally at the time, and we did write to care.data SRO and say, don't do this, please. And I guess the key for me was care.data is actually quite a good thing if you think about it logically, but the problem was you don't jump straight to execution. You actually have to bring a whole lot of people with you, and if you don't bring people with you with the right vision, then you end up getting into quite a mess, and that's exactly what happened in reality. And my biggest problem with it is it moved from purpose of data to flow of data, and they are two different things in law. And the law requires you to understand what the purpose of the data flow is, the purpose of the data you're going to use, and then map the flow. And that's the logic of it. And we ended up concentrating on flow, so the type 1 and type 2 opt-outs, which were sort of pervasive from there, so stopping your GP sending records out, and if they did send them out to the Health and Social Care Information Centre, now NHS Digital, that then the type 2 beyond that, i.e. beyond that organisation, just confused the population. This debate about what the population want to know, they didn't know what a type 1 and a type 2 were. They couldn't vacillate that in their head in a way which made sense. But if you start to describe it in the way of what's the purpose of this data, so if this data is going to be used to solve a really tricky health problem over here, and actually the more data we get, the better evidence we get, and we don't sell it to insurance companies, and the do's are more important than the do's, actually. That's one of the bits of research we found when we were doing the work at the department. It's very much around just being clear about what your purpose of data use is, why it's important, and one of the things I forgot to say is about public benefit. There's something in there that says actually pharmaceutical companies, CROs, CMOs, all are doing something for patient benefit, and actually we've got to articulate that as a story piece, and the same with the charities. And that's really an important message. Really.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Peter. So then on to you, Chris. You're going to talk about big data challenges within Pfizer.
We're not just within Pfizer, but
okay.
so thanks for inviting me. Hello, everyone. I was going to raise a couple of fundamentals for discussion. The first one being probably the most fundamental thing, which is the big part of big data. I think we've heard a lot in the last couple of days about how we have unprecedented access to vast sets of data, and I think when we talk about patient data, that's undeniably true, and that's an excellent position to be in. I would dare to suggest, though, that the same is not necessarily true of all sets of data, all types of data. Some data we're very good at sharing. I think others we have work to do. So I work in new drug development, and specifically within that, the manufacture of clinical supplies. The kind of data I'm looking at, it's not patient data. I'm looking at data about products and about processes. I get very jealous when I hear people talk about patient data. We're talking about data sets in millions, whereas even in a large pharma company, batch data is probably more likely to be numbered in hundreds, particularly in R&D. And if you're working on kind of new, novel manufacturing processes, it's even less. So as you can see, there's kind of a hole in the data there. I mean, when you look at all of the data, yes, that's very big. But when you start to focus in on certain niche areas, I think there are gaps that need to be plugged. And I won't be the first person to say this. I've heard it mentioned several times in the past couple of days. It would seem that collaboration and openness is the way to go to address those gaps. And it's kind of, there's another kind of element to this. And I think it's almost like, we talk about data holes, data has a kind of gravity to it. It feels, when you have a lot of data, it kind of draws in like data about that. You have a lot of patient data. It feels easy to kind of just expand that and bring in more and more and more. But when you're dealing with a data hole, it's not want to mix metaphors too much, but it's a bit like building a cathedral. It's going to be hard. It's going to take a long time. You'll probably not be there at the end of it all, but you know it's going to be worthwhile at the end of it. But you have to start somewhere. Somebody has to start. So we have to address those. The other fundamental I wanted to mention was about the balance of good data science and domain knowledge. The illustration I usually use to describe that, it involves divorce, margarine, and cholera, so bear with me on this one. There is actually, some of you may already know about this one, there's famously a very, very strong correlation between the rate of margarine consumption in the US and the divorce rate in the state of Maine. It's actually, it is what would be described as statistically very significant, and it's a frivolous example of the kind of correlation that is easily attained when you have large enough data sets. Obviously, there's not really anybody who's believing there's a causality in play here, but you need that blend of the ability to access the data in multivariate fashion, but at the same time kind of assess it and deal with it. On the flip side of it, there's a data scientist called Kiera Radensky, so I don't know if everybody's aware of her work. If you get to see her TED talk, it's excellent, I think. So about a decade ago, she was working on connecting thousands of news feeds and vast sets of reference data, and applying machine learning to kind of just build a huge network of causality or of data to see what the connections and what you can find essentially. One of the fascinating things that came out of that was it flagged a likely outbreak of cholera in Cuba, and the kind of initial response to that was to say, well, this surely must be a spurious correlation. There's not been cholera in Cuba for 130 years or more. Yeah. It just doesn't feel like it's the right thing. However, when you then look at the data behind that suggestion and you bring in good subject matter expertise to actually assess that data, we saw there is actually a pattern there that makes sense. But you would never get to that pattern without the strong analytical tools. You're looking at a combination of droughts and floods over a 2-year span that just really hasn't been researched before. But you're bringing in things like GDP, political framework, and it's also about there's an increased risk where there's reduced levels of drinking water, which you'd think is counterproductive for a waterborne disease. But when you actually bring in expertise in this area, you realize that, well, actually, the more drinking water you have, the more likelihood you have of flushing the disease out. So it's actually, this does become a factor. Lo and behold, 2013, there was a cholera outbreak in Cuba for the first for over 130 years. So it's this combination of the cutting-edge analytical tools, but having the understanding behind that to actually separate the margarine stories from the cholera stories is such an important thing. And I'm not the first person to mention skills in the last couple of days, but it's certainly something which I've wanted to bring up.
Okay, that's great, Chris. And I think those margarine and cholera stories will stick with us as we go through this session, definitely. I suppose a lot of our conversation today has been based on patient data or data generated in relatively controlled environments. The next question I'd like to ask is, given the plethora and the explosion of data that we've got from wearables, from social media, mining, etc., is bigger data necessarily better for us? And in fact, do the same principles that you described, maybe with a patient data lens, apply to this wider data set? So maybe, Peter, if you'd like to kick us off there.
Okay, so I've got strong views on this, as you might have gathered. So I don't know, how many people have got one of these on their wrist? Okay, so I'm doing a comparison at the moment between TomTom and Fitbit, and at the moment TomTom's winning as a more accurate product. But I guess that's the key point here. It's about what the provenance of the data is and how that data is captured and how reliable it is. And we are going to see the velocity and volume of this data just accelerate. The speed at which you can grab bits of data these days is phenomenal. Now, even this, which I didn't think is as accurate as TomTom, not making any plugs for TomTom, the key point is, with this, we can do things like track patient movement, as an example, if post-operatively they have had some surgery and we want to make sure they're not sitting sedentary, as an example. So for me, this type of technology is going to be quite enabling in terms of how we do things. We have to apply the rules, which is, this would be my consent into a data set, and it would be from my personal data, which I'm giving that consent. What I wouldn't want is Fitbit to just sell it to people. So I think, the rules need to be the rules we apply to this stuff. I also think we need to make sure whenever we're starting to ingest types of data and the data analysis and sort of big data science, you need to understand provenance of that data. How reliable is this data? What's it going to tell me? Is it going to give me a proximate? Is it going to give me a proxy? Is it going to be accurate? So getting that right is important, and having the metadata to support that is key. And yes, I think, I heard this morning about, the digital factory as an example with no paper. That the data there would just be phenomenal in terms of the manufacturing process. But actually, we have vast quantities of data. Facebook and Google and all the rest absorb data from all of us every day. They know exactly where we are, on what road, what speed we're travelling, how much congestion there is. They predict that for you. They tell you a new route. Yet we haven't got into that in healthcare, and we need to start doing it. And I think also there's a really good place for things like AI as well, artificial intelligence. I don't call it artificial intelligence as cognitive at the moment. I call it as machine training and machine learning, because that's where we are. And I think the key for that is, I have a lack of radiologists. Now, if I can get a computer algorithm to read a X-ray and say, do you know what, that's normal, you don't need to deal with it, and then focus the specialist skills on the not normal, and actually that's where I will get both efficiency and benefit gain out of it. And the volume of research data that comes out of that is huge, because it's actually about how we manage our resources, and it's also about how we intervene in different ways. So I think that's kind of where I'd start.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. Gerald?
Yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely convinced that, as you say, it's up to you opting in, not TomTom, whoever it was, selling it on your behalf. But as long as there's the feedback loop, people will. I mean, you take TomTom as a lovely example. You talked about the fact that now it tells you where the traffic jams are and everything. Well, 15 years ago they didn't, did they? And they'd take you down somebody's garden path because they got the road wrong and all this kind of rubbish. But people still bought the things at ridiculous prices and stuck them in their cars because they were so much more useful than not having them, which was the only option at the time. So it's going to take time to evolve, and it's going to get better over time. But as long as there is some immediate, transparent value back to the person, then they will opt in, and that will allow the data to build up, and the programming and so on that starts to generate real value. So I mean, I think the trick is finding the ways to display or to demonstrate to people that there is real value to be had out of sharing even that sort of data. And a couple of things occur to me. I was talking to a chap from Oxford Brookes University, it was actually, and he had developed an app for your iPhone that could tell if you were having a stroke within 10 steps. Because there are little accelerators in your phone. In an incredibly short period of time, it gets used to how you walk. Right. And if your walk goes a bit askew, it can tell incredibly quickly. And it could tell whether you're drunk,
yes,
or whether you're just dodging some young chap on a tricycle or whatever it was. It could tell that very quickly, and it could identify if you're at a health risk.
Gosh.
And because it's your phone, it can find an ambulance.
Yeah.
Now, that sort of stuff, you could come up, I'm sure, we could brainstorm 50 in this room in an hour of viable things that you could do with current data. And you start putting those out there, and people will opt in to sharing this kind of data, no problem at all. And then it's only a small step, I would argue, to another chap I was talking to who was from UCL. And I've told a couple of people about this, but he designed, it was nanometers, so it's smaller than that, I can't actually show you. And it was had a little coil around it and a little bit of flex, and it was a blood pressure monitor. And it was small enough you could put it in one of the little tiny arteries somewhere and forget about it. It didn't need any power source because it had a coil around it. And it was so little, as long as you walked vaguely near a power source every now and again, it would send back a message about your blood pressure. Well, we all know 4 to 6 week lead time increased blood pressure against heart attacks. So you just put a power source somewhere near your front door. Every time you walk in and out of the house, it takes your blood pressure. And what do you know? 2 or 3 dodgy days in a row. And again, it sends a message to your GP. GP phones you up and says, "Come in, we need to check out your blood pressure. Something's going wrong here." Now, but you get in steps. That's my point. You start with the app on your phone that tells you that people have complete control over, and then it's a short step to them saying, "Actually, that's really useful," and you move. And I agree completely. Also, by the way, we do not have AI, and I get really quite cross with people. And we've had someone, actually also from UCL as it happens, design machine learning for our database. And, we talk to all sorts of clever people doing all sorts of exciting things from Washington and all the rest of it. And it's just nonsense. Nobody has AI at the moment. I wish people would stop using it, including that very elegant, articulate chap yesterday from whatever it was called, Responsible AI, that company, Benevolent AI. It's machine learning. Anyway, but that's by the way. One last point, and then I'll move on, because there was a comment about correlations and whether or not you needed intelligent people to tell the difference between correlations and actual causation. And I remember when I was doing a statistics course quite a while ago anyway, that the classic case was the genetic nature of speaking French. Because if you do a correlation study on the French population, it's so obviously the case that it must be genetic, because they all speak French. They're born, with French-speaking parents, there they are, bang, jump, clearly, as strong a correlation as you could possibly ask for. There you go. So.
Right, okay. Right, so big data again in maybe the rare diseases world. So Nick, just talking about that plethora and wider data set, how does it help some of your membership?
Yeah, I think I'd like to just have a slightly cautionary tone here, just because there's lots of data out there, and I'm sure there are valuable uses here, but I think we need to be a little bit careful not to say it will be easier when we have more data. So in an earlier session today, I forget the speaker's name, but she pointed out that that the European Medicines Agency is approving drugs very, very quickly, and then HTA bodies come along and suck air over their teeth and say, we probably need a bit more evidence here before we can make a decision. So they're calling for more data, while other organisations are being more flexible with the use of data and using it more wisely. And I'd also point out that the first decision was a life or death one. So maybe we could be a bit more flexible. And so I just wanted to say that we don't always need more data. We can be more innovative. The other thing is that deep data, as opposed to wide pools of data, so high quality data on, to really get the best out of genomic data, we need really high quality phenotypic data. And the more information we have about the impact of conditions, the more valuable it is. So there are different directions to go, I think.
Yeah, okay, that's great. And Chris, I know you were keen on sort of data integrity, but did you feel you illustrated the point with some of your...
So just, kind of building on some of these examples from the panel on the wearables question. So that was the first thing that I thought was, being someone who's trained to work in a laboratory with equipment, I'm a trained scientist operating on calibrated equipment. You're giving out wearables to what feels to me to be untrained people using, whatever they've got. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't do it. I think it just puts a focus on the design. And I think Gerald's example there was an excellent example of very, very good design. Something that we walk past the door and it's delivering. And Peter, I think, mentioned, I'm really pleased to hear you mention about some of the V's of big data, the volume and the velocity. But when it comes to wearables, I think it's the veracity is the one that I was going to mention. It's like, if it's well designed, yes, you should be able to trust it. If it's not so well designed, at best, it might just not be very good, but at worst, it could actually be more dangerous. I guess the example I give is that, if it's a poorly designed piece of technology. I use my phone as an example. Okay, I track my steps on my phone, but it has a behavioural bias on the data because I take it out of my pocket and leave it on my desk for weekdays. So my weekends look big, my weekends look good, my weekdays look, they aren't as good as my weekends, but they're not as bad as it says. And it's actually introducing bias, and bias is actually probably more dangerous than not having the data at all. So, and then there's another thing about, and that's kind of just the design, and then there's the other part about, well, I think there's when you get to a certain scale of data, then the anomalies start to bleed out, and that's not too bad. But I don't know, was maybe here at the session yesterday, so we talked about the company that's rewarding you for lifestyle. Every 10,000 steps, if you do 10,000 steps, you get a reward. I can't be the only person who thought about strapping the phone to the dog. It's open to cheating.
Yes,
I'm not saying that, and that's very frivolous. And I shouldn't. It's a serious subject. But you're putting a lot of reliance. You could be putting a lot of reliance on data that it might not be true. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, and Shah, did you want to
Yeah, I
come in
just
here?
wanted to say that I think in 2013, when we did publish the Big Data Roadmap, there's one particular page which outlines throughout kind of the development pathway of what technologies are being used currently and what potentially is going to be used in the future. And actually, if we reflect back even now, we're probably still using the same kind of technologies or the same kind of information and data as what we were before. And I think the other thing which I wanted to stress in terms of decision makers, whether it's regulatory HTA bodies or from a healthcare perspective, they're still dependent on the same kind of data. So those processes, in a sense, are still fairly similar. So they're still going to look at kind of the randomized clinical trials. If there is supporting real-world data studies as such, then that's fine. They're not necessarily looking at studies which are collating data from wearables as such. We've not quite got there. There are discussions which are taking place across EMA in terms of the big data initiative, for which they're having discussions. And similarly, I think earlier this year there was a nice round table around how we would evaluate medical or digital technologies as well. Is that going to be any different to how they evaluate any other type of technology as such as well? And there's a lot of open questions there at the moment, so I don't see that as necessarily having a huge impact. And I'm involved in one of the IMI projects on big data for better outcomes, and sometimes I am kind of quite startled that across a lot of the public and private partners and organizations, we're not really talking about big data as such. We're still kind of talking about the same types of data.
Yeah, okay. I mean, we also mentioned social media as a repository as well, and in PwC we do a lot of things around social listening, which was actually helping us in many ways understand how, receptions of drugs, etc., what people thought of pricing. I think the fear at the moment is given fake news and maybe planting stuff via Twitter, etc. To what extent can you believe social media, which was meant to be, one of those great repositories?
But there is a good example of that in the States. So New York, a young intern doctor came up with the idea of looking at what the feeds were from social media. So the idea was, in influenza breakout, what do you do? And actually, where do you get your trends from? Yeah. And what's the intervention that occurs? And the intervention that they did, based on that public data effectively, was the stuff that we freely give away, was actually, I've got a cold. You get hotspots occurring, and then they put an intervention of putting a unit in there and said on the radio or whatever mechanism, hey, come and get a flu jab, or get some meds. And it actually, it was quite an interesting model because actually it's quite disruptive in the way you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm afraid I'm going to go off script now because I can see some really interesting people in the audience who want to ask some questions. So I'll go to Loy first and then on to Trevor. So, Loy, would you like to say who you are and who you represent?
I'm Loy Lobo. I do a lot of work in digital health strategy. A couple of comments on which I'd like to invite the views of the panel. First was Kiera.data. One of the things that I got into a debate with people involved at the time, and we felt one of the important things missing was any sanction for abuse of the data. That wasn't discussed at all. And we saw a recent case where data was used ostensibly for AI, but there was consent was not sought to obtain either part or all of that data, which one could argue was probably not even necessary for that experiment. So please comment on that. The other thing is we tend to get seduced by the notion of big data. I was privileged to sit next to the guy who ran the National Spine Program for the NHS, and that was 70 terabytes of data. That's not really big data, but given that this was 10 years of the health records of everyone in the NHS, we found astonishing anomalies because let's not forget this data comes into the system because hospitals get paid on the basis of what they code. So it did not necessarily reflect the treatments that people were getting. It reflected some of the behaviors of hospitals to optimize the revenue they were getting. So the point that you made, it's really important for people who are looking at this data to understand what is going on in the data before you can start drawing any sort of meaningful conclusions out of it. So I'd like to invite your comments and reactions to that.
Sorry, and can I just check, can people at the back hear the comment here? Yes, I'm getting some nods. Okay, so go ahead.
Since I seems to be the person that's dealing with care.data, let me deal with that. So the interesting part about care.data is there were sanctions. The sanctions were if you breach the Data Protection Act, you're going to get knocked over the hands with your knuckles with the data protection regulation that currently exists. So, a breach is a breach, and whatever the fine is, and the data protection regulator was actually giving out quite high fines in terms of the 500,000. Several hospitals got fined quite a huge chunk of cash. And bizarrely, that created then a risk-averse version of the world, because everybody didn't want to share data at that point. So it's this balancing act of saying what's responsible and what's the right way to do it. And care.data, I guess, was focusing on the outcome they wanted to achieve, which is fine, that's okay. But actually, the data protection regulation and case law is available to give you plenty of guidance about what can be done in that space. So I think that's interesting. I think what's more prevalent is the changes that are coming in with the GDPR, because that changes the game, and it changes the game by saying it's no longer 500,000 that you'll get a fine over. It's 4% of global turnover. Now you just do the maths on that, and that's a lot of sort of cash for big corporates particularly. Even my organisation, it's 40 million, and everybody says, well, 40 million is not an awful lot of money. I'll tell you what, on £1 billion that's stretched, that's a lot of money. So, we need to take that seriously, and we are, because it's a fundamental part of our delivery. So I think just understanding that is quite important. So I do think there has been a structure there. Maybe it wasn't played up enough on care.data, but that was sort of the prevalent sort of position on that. Do you want me to stop there?
Yeah. Well, or do you have a comment on the other point?
Well, I have a couple of other points. So in terms of your incentives to why people sort of code data, I can tell you now that's not quite true, because I sit in 2 organisations over my career where codification has been used. Yes, it's optimised for procedures that are there. Predominantly, it's pretty accurate in general terms. Organisations will optimise the way you code it, so you get the best payment, but actually the procedures are pretty much accurate. And the research data I did a long time ago with the Research Capability Programme demonstrated actually that the correlations are quite strong. The bits that are odd are when you start to compare data between 2 different organisations. So the human factors error. So example, you take a data set of people that have got both mental health and cancer, and we had 7,000 people in our data set, and of that whole data set, 18 of them were recorded differently as sex in the 2 different data sets. How is that possible? It's a human error issue. It's not an optimization or coding issue. So that's more important. And that, going back to your point about feedback to the patient and feedback to the user of the data is so critical in all of this, because you won't improve data quality unless you do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
If I could just say, as is clear, I'm all for trying to encourage people in a number of steps to sort of share quite a lot more data. But you can build quite a lot in from a process point of view to limit the opportunities for abuse. And I was trying to remember the details of it, and I've forgotten, which is really irritating, but I was at the Mobile World Congress earlier in the year, and the telecoms, the Swiss telecoms body that all the mobile operators belong to, had come up with a process to make it much easier for people to use their phones for buying simple things. And the whole point was there was a step between the phone and even the operator and the system that actually paid the person at the other end, so that the data was not being ever shared directly with the person that you were buying the stuff from. And there was a step. All they knew was they were getting paid by Lloyds Bank or whatever it was that they put behind this system. And you'd shared your data with Lloyds, and it was not even visible on your phone, but your phone was still the mechanism. Lloyds recognised your phone when you tried to buy something, and the person was paid by a Lloyds account that was a common account, and so on. You know, and they had several other examples. I could try and remember they had one for sort of connected home to do with your refrigerator and everything. It was, and I'm afraid if I spent half an hour, I'd dredge more of it up. But there's a lot you can do in that sort of way to reduce the opportunities for people to abuse the data that would be gathered in the sorts of way I'm suggesting. And there are intelligent people, more intelligent than I, who are thinking through these problems, and they should not be a reason for ducking out on the opportunities that come from actually trying to do more of this.
Yeah.
Would be my
I know
argument.
you don't want to talk about blockchain, Gerald, but blockchain is a way of securing a DNA wallet effectively, and transmission of genomic and genetic data again is seen as an opportunity.
Mhm.
Trevor, you had your hand up.
Probably where the panel could help suggest ways we could get better or more collaboration on qualifying some of these wearables and so on. I mean, the example I give is in COPD, the 6-minute walk test is a regulatory requirement. I mean, it's not the only one, but usually people invent it if they forgot to do it because they don't want to be found lacking in as a good patient in the clinical trial. So wearables are an obvious one in terms of movement. But what we found is it depends on which wearable we've got. So what we did at IMI and PRO, patient reported outcomes, we had a consortium of companies with the regulatory agencies. We pulled in 56 different wearables and did all the robotic walk tests and found 4 of them that were good. So the regulatory agency can say, if I get data from those 4 devices, I can rely on it, it's qualified. But haven't we got to do more of that? Because this is being led by a consumer revolution in wearable technology, not by a pharmaceutical device regulation.
Yeah, exactly. And it goes back to Chris's point and his dog, really, I guess, as well, in many ways within that. Yes.
The dogs tend to go for more than 6.
So how do we get that better collaboration then to address the issues that Trevor's positioning?
I mean, I think the IMI initiative is actually pretty good when it comes to that. And I think the ABPI has been pushing for a lot more kind of open collaboration type of initiatives, because I think in terms of overcoming the issues around kind of trust and so forth, and getting buy-in from different stakeholders, it seems to be the way to go. I think we've been kind of looking to work with Greater Manchester in terms of kind of how we can facilitate collaborations kind of with them, and across both their data capabilities there, but as well as that in some of the ways in which they're able to provide healthcare a bit better as well. So as I mentioned, if there's it's really about getting a bit of a better steer from some of the decision makers and having them being as part of the process, because what you recognise is there's a bit of a knowledge gap across a range of different stakeholders, and being able to bridge that effectively and have them part of the discussion is a key element of that. And I think that's worked quite well in quite a few IMI projects where you have been able to pull in different stakeholders into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. And any more questions from the audience?
Can I make a comment on that last
Sorry,
question?
excuse
Sorry,
me.
yeah, sorry.
You did say.
No. The only thing I'd say is we need a framework for doing this, and I entirely agree with you. And you can buy a plethora of blood pressure monitors on the App Store these days, which are random number generators, quite frankly, at one level. And then you've got others which are well orchestrated, and devices which have gone through device accreditation. Okay, so what we need is a framework for doing this. I know NICE are working at the moment in trying to work out what that framework looks like on behalf of the system, but it is a framework of understanding that, and it's a framework that actually is scalable. So if it's information, you want to ensure the information's accurate, so that's the first level, and that doesn't need to be a fully regulated, it needs to be authoritative. That's the key thing. when you're talking about a device then that you're going to rely on to take some reading from, that has to be accredited in some way. And it's that spectrum and all the shades of grey in between that you need to work through. But we do need that framework, because at the moment it is run by the consumer market. It is not run by anything else.
Any other questions? There's one over here.
Haven't we already got, I mean, this is just data. I know there's a lot of it, but it is just data, and it's devices, and we've used devices forever. And this is all stuff we know about in our world. It's the consumer piece that Trevor's talking about that's the really unusual element of all of this, isn't it? You know, so Google goes and does a clinical trial without telling anybody. They make a lot of mistakes. They do a lot of things badly. But they'll learn. They'll work it out. We all learn that way. Most of us don't go into things and don't make mistakes at the start. They'll do it better next time. They'll follow the regulations. They'll do the validation process. They'll be able to do the analytical stuff with the data. And whether it's artificial reasoning or not, they'll come up with some correlations, and they'll have done, 100 billion different sort of tests on that data set. How many correlations are they going to come up with? Who's going to say that works? How are you ever going to look at that data? You're going to ask another AI to look at it? How do they do it? What does that mean?
So your question is looking for solutions for that plethora of data.
So what you've got is that you've got a whole load of data that's coming out of the system. The medical world can deal with this stuff. It's the consumer stuff that is difficult to deal with.
Yeah, okay. Not sure if everyone got this, because you're conveniently hiding behind a wall here. But that's, again, maybe we've cracked it on the inside in terms of the data and devices that pharma collects, but with the challenge of all the data available from the consumer, what can we do to actually best maximise the value and the opportunity of that? Don't want to no, I don't want to load you up all the time, Peter, unless anybody else has a comment first.
I have a comment on the activity tracker and 10,000 steps and the dog. Chris, United Healthcare is not that stupid. They have established a fairly specific algorithm to make the gate
human
measure the
sensitive.
gait analysis, and only at that point they established a fingerprint for the walk. And based on that information, they report and pays out money.
Right.
So actually, I'm really pleased you mentioned that, because I think that actually talks to the comment I tried to make earlier, which is about that. That's an example of actually very good design. It's been thought through, it's been designed well. It's kind of proofed against abuse, which is all the hallmarks of good data collection. Whereas something less well designed, or subject to abuse, you're going to get a bunch of rubbish data from that, and that's knowing the difference between the two is the key. Knowing that this is trustworthy, we can do something with this. This stuff over here, have a go, do what you like with it, but just be wary of how much you trust in that data.
Yeah. And Yuri, just as a question with that, did they realise that was a risk and design it in from the start, or did they learn the hard way and then put it in place?
Right
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, they did look at least 10 different activity trackers to ensure that there is some equivalency in terms of the number of steps and so on. And the only ones that were picked for the programs are the ones that show specific level of correctness, I guess, within the specific for the specific device. So that was sort of the criteria of how devices were picked for the program.
Yeah.
In the future will be bring your own device to open up any device that could be used by the member of the plan.
I'd just like to respond to this comment about there being too many correlations available in the data. I remember, back when I was a lad, they brought out these electronic computers you were able to play chess with, and I remember I liked playing chess when I was a boy, so I remember I going to some shop and there was some thing with red LED lights and the salesman telling me, it calculates 215 million possible moves. And I was sitting there thinking, yeah, but 214,980 are shite, So, I mean, it just doesn't matter. And the idea that Google, because they've got big processing power, can come up with a billion combinations, won't be able to tell which ones are useful or not, is just daft. They will. And okay, they won't all be perfect first time, but they'll do repeated tests and they'll narrow it down, and then they'll have a direction of travel where they can see something valuable they can do with this set of data, and they'll build a service on it, or they won't, and they give up and they do a different one. But it's just the fact that the computing power is there to provide these big numbers of stuff is not a reason for saying that the data is just useless. It really isn't.
The point is that
It's what-
the Googles are not imprisoned by the history of our understanding of what we think the travel direction is. I mean,
Right.
they're thinking out of the box
Yeah.
with information.
Exactly.
This
Yeah.
is what the data's telling me,
Yeah.
not what our preconceived view we want to hear from the data.
Yeah, absolutely. No, well,
Fine.
point well made, Reva. Maybe time for one very quick question, and then we'll move to a wrap-up. So any burning questions from the audience here that we could answer quickly? I sense not. I'm going to ask each of the panellists in a minute to give, one key message they'd like you as the audience to go away with, ideally framed as in the brevity of a tweet. Not a Trump-like tweet, though, please. And then I'll just try and sum up. I think this was actually a very positive debate, actually. We're talking about a lot of the sources and the potential that brings. The recognition that we are on a journey. It is incremental innovation, probably at its best. And to come up with a sat-nav analogy, you probably don't even know where we're going necessarily, but with, in terms of multiple routes going to that. Taking the sat-nav analogy on further, I really like the view about us having a health sat-nav with all of the information that flows into us so we can course correct as we go through in terms of managing our own health as well. Clearly what was coming over to me was transparency, trust, the requirement for a feedback loop as well, both to users and to generators of data, the key role of the benefit in terms of that, and watching out for your odd causality correlations, such as your cholera, margarine, and divorce, which I think will stick with me forever. And then again, we didn't really talk about industrial strategy and Brexit, but to your point, Peter, now's the time in terms of data as an asset that we've got in the UK. We've got the life sciences capability to build on it and mine it in the right way to actually help reinvigorate the life sciences industry as we go through this period of transition. But let me leave the panel now to sum up. So Peter, I know you've done a lot of talking, so you're quite good to pass, but if you just need some passing words with it.
I think for me, it's data is good. It needs to be securely and properly managed, but actually it's for public benefit. At the end of the day, we get a good correlation of data to enable science, to enable better outcomes for patients. And if we focus on that, that's the sort of the general delivery, really.
That's great. Gerald?
So for me, absolutely, change is coming, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, the end is nigh. Mr. Google is going to take over the world, and we might as well be on side and opting in and making sure it works for us. So I'm saying change is coming. We've had a lot of talks the last couple of days where people have mentioned it and then ducked it completely and said, actually, yes, but we carry on as before. It's been a bit disappointing, if I'm honest. But it is coming, and it should be embraced. And embraced, it could be made really powerful.
Great. Thanks, Gerald.
I think two particular messages, I guess. One is around communicating the uses of data, just telling that narrative and that story, and I think that's definitely important in terms of engendering trust and also working and explaining how it works within the ecosystem so that the people who you are working with, your other stakeholders, your collaborators or so forth, are also telling their part of the story and how it's all integrated as well.
Great. Thank you. Nick?
Well said, Shahida. You mentioned earlier understanding patient data, and I think that's the tool that allows anyone using data to be able to explain why they're using the data, what it's for, under what legal basis they can use the data. And I think it's important that anyone using patient data can explain that to the, I hope, in the future owners of that data.
Chris?
And what I would finish, I'm going to finish on something really boring, sorry. And what I'd say is that for all, I'd love to talk about the exciting new stuff, but you should only be allowed to talk about the exciting new stuff if you've got the fundamentals right, and it's the boring stuff about good data curation and stewardship, common data standards. But if you can crack all that stuff, then the volume will come, and with the volume comes the exciting new insights.
That's great. Thanks, Chris, and thanks to all of you. Stay in this room if you're here for speed to access, adaptive and accelerated R&D. And in the meantime, just join me in thanking the panel for their great insights this afternoon. Thank you.